The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Losing the Narrative. So a month or so ago, I did an event in Toronto with Dr. Jordan Peterson. I've already posted a video with my thoughts about it, and the full video from the event is now up free for everybody to watch, and I think it's got like 300,000+ views, so all of you have probably watched it. I have since posted some articles about Jordan as his popularity rises. There have been a number of interviews with him where he's said a number of, from my perspective, terrible things. And there were some people who were a little mad that he did this. Why would you not go, back on stage with him and tell him what you think of what? Well, I would be happy to. I have no aversion to going back on stage with Jordan ever again, but that doesn't mean that I can't talk about it. But today I want to go back to the discussion that we had in Toronto, because there was only one question that I prepared in advance. And I had no idea what his answer was going to be. It was genuine curiosity. Everything else was just discussion. But this question was one that I had prepared out of my own curiosity. And that was, what is it that you fear we will lose if people stop believing in gods? His answer, his immediate answer, was that we'll lose the narrative. And I think I've pointed out before that this is a non-answer. Because if the narrative is, the various God story, and I say, what do you fear we're going to lose? We're going to lose the narrative. I'm basically asking you what happens if we lose belief in the narrative. But there's a number of problems with this that I thought I'd address, because I think that it demonstrates not only a fear that he has, but a completely unwarranted fear. So the first thing to remember is that if you go back and listen to Jordan's first interaction with Sam Harris on Sam's Waking Up podcast, you hear a lengthy discussion about truth. And Sam is advocating for a reality-based truth, or truth is that which is consistent with reality. And Jordan is arguing at times on behalf of a metaphorical truth, that it's true if it's good for you. As a skeptic, as a realist, I have a number of problems with this. Now, I'm not remotely saying there's no value in metaphor. There certainly can be. But I'm concerned about reality, the reality I experience, the reality that I ostensibly share with other people, the reality that we seem to agree we share. And for me, the value in a metaphor, the value in the narrative, is in whatever lesson actually relates to the facts about reality. So if you tell me that you're worried that we're going to lose the narrative if we stop believing in gods, you're essentially saying, if we don't believe in gods, we're not going to believe in these stories about gods, which is almost a tautology, because believing in the stories it requires this belief in God. But the value of the stories is not in accepting that the story is true. It is in discovering what truths that story tells. And those truths have to relate to reality. To say there's a metaphorical truth that is the metaphorical substrate under, yes, you can say that kind of thing. But we have essentially a story. Here's a story about a god and God's interaction with reality. And there are two positions that one could take. One could either accept that the story is literally factual, or one could not accept that the story is literally factual. And in both of those cases, you still have the option of saying, this story is literally factual and has valuable information for us. Or you can say, I am not convinced this story is literally factual, but it still has valuable information for us. The very notion that we would somehow lose the valuable part is kind of absurd to me, because if it's valuable, it persists. Now, that doesn't mean you can't lose something that's valuable. It's just that the fear that you will lose it if you don't actually believe it's literally true is a problem. I pushed back on him during the discussion about this to say, well, we'll lose the narrative, but what of value are we going to lose? And it took him a second or two, if I remember right, and then he said art, that we are going to lose art if people stop believing in gods. I realize that I am constantly in debate mode, and that I have spent years on the atheist experience, and I've done loads of debates, and that perhaps we are speaking at cross purposes, that we're not talking about the same thing. But when I ask someone, what are we going to lose if people stop believing in God? And your ultimate answer, your ultimate clear answer, is that we will lose art. Well, first of all, my concern is whether or not the God story is true, not whether or not it supplies us with art. So simply your fear that we will lose art, even if it were to be a grounded, reasonable fear, which I don't think it is, isn't enough to warrant belief in a God. I care about whether or not the stories are true, not whether or not believing in them produces art. But also, I don't think there's any risk at all of us losing art if we lose belief in a God. There's loads of art, both technically drawings, paintings, music, films, books. All of these things don't require a belief in a God to produce. And we'll set aside Jordan's assertion that all of us atheists really have something that qualifies as a God. I'm talking about belief in a God, not I'm going to label you as somebody who has belief in a God. It's very confusing to me that the man can say that we are not very good at understanding what it is that we actually believe, something that I agree with, not to the extent that he goes, but I agree that people aren't always crystal clear on what their beliefs are. But then to have him go on and pretend that while we are not clear about what we believe, he is clear about what we believe. So much so that he can say that the professed atheists actually have a God belief, they just don't know us. He's elevating his understanding of the world to a higher level than anybody else in order to denounce what it is that conflicts with his view about atheists and morality. But that's separate from this narrative issue here, because there are countless gods that we don't believe in, and yet we still know of them, and we know their stories. We know the stories about the Roman and Greek gods, the pantheon of gods there. We know the stories of the gods of other religions that we don't believe in. We know of the stories of gods from religions that have died off. The very notion that we would lose these narratives if we stop believing them is bizarre, especially since there's probably going to be somebody who still believes and still tries to promote. But for me, the value of the narrative is not the narrative. The narrative is the story. It's a construct. It could be true or not true. The value is in the moral, in the lesson that story portrays to us. That's where the value is. I don't have to think there was a talking chicken actually claiming that the sky was falling. I don't have to believe that Dumbo was convinced that he had a magical feather. I don't have to believe that there was actually a boy that cried wolf. In order to understand and value the lessons that those stories tell. There's nothing about the lesson that requires me accepting that this is portraying true events. The valuable thing within those stories is not the narrative, it's the moral, it's the lesson. And those things persist even if those individual narratives get lost. There are probably countless fables, children's stories that have been lost to time that teach the same lessons that other stories do. And those same lessons can be taught absent a narrative. You can, come up with a side analogy to demonstrate why hyperbole might be bad, or why people aren't likely to believe you if you keep saying false things. Jordan's fear seems to be that the bulk of humanity is just so confused and ignorant and stupid that they cannot be reasoned with honestly and openly. They have to have the valuable stuff wrapped up in fanciful stories in order for us to continue that. And if we lose that, oh my gosh, the world will decay because people don't actually believe this anymore. But the truth is, I can read the entire Bible and find things in there that are good and true and valuable about charity, about the human condition, and also recognize that the stories aren't necessarily true and that there's no good reason to think that they're tied to some sort of supernatural creator. Why? Because I'm applying skepticism, and because I'm able to distinguish between the valuable part, the part that relates to actual reality from the metaphorical part, which is just a tool. The metaphorical part, the narrative, is a way to frame an idea so that it is palatable to people. But it's not the only way to frame an idea, and you don't have to frame it in something that is untruthful or not actually real. There's a little bit more here, though. You see, when Jordan was asked about what a true atheist would be like, he went to a narrative, specifically Crime and Punishment, and a character in there who was atheistic, who rationalized being a cold-blooded killer, and said that this is what atheists would actually be like. So when he was asked a question about reality, he went to a narrative that he doesn't believe is true. I don't think he's convinced that the characters of the story actually happened. He just went to what he views as the truth at the core of it. The problem is that the truth at the core of it isn't actually true. There are, in fact, people like myself who don't believe in a God, who have advocated for views like secular humanism. And I can't think of any realistic circumstance where I could ever become a cold-blooded killer. But any of the circumstances that might apply, I think would apply to me, even when I was a fundamentalist Christian, even when I believed not only the narrative, but the truth of that narrative. So when asked a question about reality, he goes to a story and plucks out a character. And what he's really doing is saying, this is the sum total of what I know and understand about atheism, is this character. I'm so enamored with the archetypes and the fiction that I read this book and this has become my understanding of what an atheist is. Yet he doesn't realize that he doesn't require anybody to believe that the story in Crime and Punishment is true, that the characters were real, that these events actually occurred. And this fear of losing the narrative is also flies in the face of evidence to the contrary. We are constantly creating new narratives. Yes, some of them manifest as sitcoms on TV. Some of them manifest as dramas on TV. Some of them manifest in comic books where we have some of the grandest archetypes, and then those get translated to like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't have to believe that there's actually a Captain America to know something about honor and duty and virtue. I don't have to believe that there's actually something like a Batman in order to learn lessons, valuable lessons, and value the stories surrounding those lessons about the conflict between judgment and vengeance. Meanwhile, we have Harry Potter. Now, I think, if I recall correctly, that Jordan's not a big fan of Harry Potter. I think he may have actually used it in a negative sense to portray a point. I may be completely wrong about that, because it's difficult to follow all the things that he's said and what he's professed through the layers of obfuscation. But if anybody needed any evidence that we are not likely to lose a narrative or its value, all they need to do is look at the Harry Potter series. I'm sure there are people out there who went from wishing that the Harry Potter universe was real to believing, in a delusionary sense, that the Harry Potter world was real. But whether or not people believed it was real, there are plenty of people who clearly do not believe that it's real, recognize that it's fiction, and yet they still sort themselves into houses based on their character. This is kind of like a fictionalized version of various personality tests. You are Gryffindor, you are Slytherin, you are Hufflepuff, you are Ravenclaw. Sorry, I didn't want to leave anything out. And they will wear the colors for those particular houses. There are people who identify their religion on their driver's license and to their government as Jedi. And some of them seem to take it incredibly serious. Whether or not they actually literally believe in midichlorians and the Force, or maybe that's the New Testament of Star Wars would be the midichlorians. We'll just stick with the Force for them. What they actually believe about it is secondary, because it's possible to not believe that Star Wars is telling a true story and still find value in the lessons and the characters that are there. This is how we have built myths. This is how we have described who we are. This is the grand structure of Joseph Campbell's myth This is who we are. We are storytellers. And sometimes it's much easier for us to say, here's an important fact about who we are, so let's put it in a story. The very idea that we must then believe the stories to be true, or we must redefine truth in such a way that it lumps this in, is absurd. The notion that ceasing to believe in God is going to make us lose art is absurd. That it's going to make us lose the value of those narratives is also absurd, because the value in those narratives are the same values that are in other narratives, and they are the same values that exist absent narratives. When you have communications with people, when you are sitting down to talk about your differences and what your values and views are in life, you can tell stories, or you can just be plain spoken, which I think is like his rule number 10, which he seems to violate almost every time he sits down. Speak plainly. Speak clearly. When somebody asks me, as they asked Jordan during our discussion, they said, if every thinking mind in the universe ceased to exist, would God still exist? Now, when I was a fundamentalist Christian, my answer would have easily and quickly been yes, because saying anything other than yes means that God is contingent upon us, upon thinking minds. And the God of classical theism, the God of my Southern Baptist Church, etc., the God of most versions of Christianity, isn't contingent upon anything. And to suggest otherwise would be heresy. And yet, he suggests otherwise. That perhaps what we've learned about, the effect the observer has on the universe, what might make it not such an easy question to answer. And he dances around with stuff that sounds like it's coming out of What the Bleep Do We Know and other pseudoscientific woo things. I have no reason to think that Harry Potter is real, that the Dark Knight is real, that the God of the Bible is real, that Crime and Punishment is real. And yet I can still recognize that there are morals, lessons, and truths within them which are real. Those are the things that are valuable, and they're valuable because they tie to the truth about reality. And I don't have to believe that fiction is nonfiction in order to recognize that. And when I stop believing the truth of a narrative, I'm not in any way required to stop accepting truths within the narrative. This is the big fear that he portrayed. I think it is outlandish and false, and I think it's there to hide a number of other concerns that are based on a concern about what might happen to reality should people discover the truth. I can't say this for sure, but it is consistent with the things I've heard him say. And it's also consistent with fears I've heard from other people. Oh, we shouldn't let people know that they don't have free will, whether or not they have will or free will. You can watch other discussions about that. There's a fear that if people found out that they don't have free will in the way they think they do, that the world would descend into chaos. There's a fear that if people find out that there isn't a God or some kind of cosmic ultimate judge of our actions, that the world will descend into chaos. There's a fear that if we mix peanut butter and chocolate, the world will descend into chaos. This is our reactionary minds inventing fears because we're terrified of what might happen if the world changes. And because we understand that there are people out there who perhaps aren't as well educated, aren't as well informed, aren't as intelligent, aren't up to whatever standard you want to invent as your gold standard of humanity, and we just don't know what they'll do. They could just lose it. We know there's people out there losing it all the time. Oh my gosh, it's cats and dogs living together. It's a nightmare. Everything's going to go bad. If it's already this bad, how much worse could it get? And these are the fears that are being preyed upon. I have all kinds of concerns about getting some sort of guru that's using a syncretic mix of philosophy and psychology and pseudoscience and religion. But mostly, I see these fears and I look around at the world and I understand where they come from. that come from a narrative that portrays chaos and decline and fear as the real consequences of actions, when that may not be the case. And so while I can value truths within a narrative, I'm not going to say that a portrayed truth in a narrative is actually true. And I'm not going to let my fear dictate what I do and don't accept. But more importantly, I'm never going to let my fear of what other people might do encourage me to deceive them into believing something for their own good.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.